Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Today we're talking about testing your server-side web application right after this intro jingle. Welcome to ScottPlusPlus. Quick recap, we're working on making the biggest evolution to our democracy since civil rights. And our weapon of choice is a web app that lets users and organizations run an election using star voting. In the previous video, we took our logging to the next level, and now we're going to do the same for our testing. To give some technical context, this is a Node.js app running Express. We already had some tests using Jest, but they were all in one file and a bunch of them were failing. So what I did is I split out the different test suites into their own files, commented everything out, and then turned them all back on one by one as I got them passing. I also cleaned up some other things as well. So why is testing important, and why did I decide to focus on that next? Concisely, testing gives us confidence, and in this case, the confidence to develop faster. We still have a lot of features to build, and I have some refactoring I'd like to do for the project, and I want to give people the confidence that these changes aren't breaking anything. That gives us quicker code reviews and better teamwork. I'm constantly trying to orient myself towards what has the biggest ROI, and I believe that laying a solid foundation of testing for this project is really going to pay off in the long run. I'll also say that a project that has some consistently failing tests is the same as a project with no tests. Once people start getting used to that signal, they start ignoring the test results, and then you're just developing blind. So it's really important to stay on top of your testing. A few words on my testing philosophy, which is basically emphasize testing user-sagas. Integration tests over unit tests, especially for something as complicated as a web app that has a bunch of services working together. My primary concern is testing the system as a whole. If the individual components are passing unit tests, but collectively they don't behave as expected, that's a fail. And I wouldn't want unit tests alone to give us a false sense of security. For this web app, that means focusing our testing on our endpoints, but more than testing each endpoint individually, I want to test full user-sagas. For example, I want to test that I can cast my vote and get a positive response, but I also want to test that after I've done that, I can't vote again, or I can hit the endpoint to confirm that the system has my ballot. To drill down on that, when we're testing, for example, that you can only vote once, I do not want to start that test by mocking a user vote into a mock database. I want to structure the test by actually hitting the cast vote endpoint and then trying to hit it again. As much as possible, I want the test to mimic user behavior. Thankfully, most of the tests were already structured this way, so awesome. Looking at this from the other side, I'm kind of saying don't waste your time with unit tests. If I have good test coverage of my user journeys, I don't feel the need to write a separate unit test for every component. Those components should be covered in the integration test, at least the common cases. Now, if something breaks and you feel writing a unit test for this particular component is going to give you confidence, stability, and increased development speed, by all means, write that test. But I don't have a separate goal to cover all my functions in a unit test. Testing is a means to an end, and not every test you write brings you meaningfully closer to it. Mocking! Probably the main thing I updated were our mocks, specifically our mock databases. Aligning with the strategy of testing user journeys, I want to mock as little as possible. In the past, I have seen tests with so many mocks that all you're testing is that you've written good mocks, which is pointless. Now, in order to minimize mocking, you may need to restructure your code, and that is fine. Do it. Testability is absolutely a criteria of good code, and I would sacrifice a lot of so-called elegance to increase testability. A question to ask is why we need to mock anything. Generally, this is because the production and testing environments are different. In a web app, some common culprits are your database, maybe sending emails to users, things you don't actually want to do when testing. So when writing your code, try to separate those out into minimal interfaces. I want to decouple my business logic from those infrastructure layers and external dependencies. So for example, my database interface will just handle direct reads and writes. I'm certainly not going to have a function that has both business logic and SQL. Now, when mocking out this database, I want it to behave as much like an actual database as possible. I don't want to mock out the expected response of a particular read. I want to actually have the functionality of writing and reading data, just without the persistence. Here's a quiz. If you want to stretch your brain for a bit, pause the video and think of the problems you might run into with a mock database that looks like this. And now unpause. Yeah, so if you are passing objects directly into and out of your database by reference, you could have situations where you're directly modifying that data elsewhere in your code. So for example, you could have a situation where you make a change and you forgot to then save that information to the database. Your test environment would still have that update and you wouldn't find the bug until you hit production. Similarly, if any of your objects don't serialize well, it would work in your test environment but not in production. So do be sure to fully serialize and deserialize on read and write for your mock database. Again, trying to mimic the production behavior as closely as possible. One last topic is invest in testing. Testing is critical for your team to make progress on your project at a good pace. So invest in the tooling you need so that you can quickly and easily run your tests as well as easily write them. If your tests are a pain to write, there will be temptation to skip them or to write poor tests, and that's a slippery slope. Thankfully, someone else on the team already set us up with a great testing environment using Jest. All we need to do is npm test and we get the results. He also set up a bunch of test inputs, so it's really easy for us to generate, for example, the payload for a test user or test election. In order to further invest in testing, I built a few more test utilities. One is building off the logging work I did last week, and it's a test logger implementation. So this, in the test environment, will block the logs and only put them to console if the test fails. Otherwise, it was impossible to find the logs just for the particular test I was debugging. There's also a simple test helper that wraps our common APIs like creating or editing an election. So when you're writing a test, you don't need to worry about things like remembering routes or setting headers or any of that. All right, that's enough for me. To recap, emphasize testing full User-Sagas, mock minimally, but when you do, prefer to mimic functionality, restructure your code if necessary to increase testability, and invest in testing. If you have any advice about testing or more broadly about developing a web app with a team, I would love to learn from you, as I'm always in a constant struggle to up my game. So leave a comment, don't be shy about your knowledge and experience. As always, thank you for watching. Now let's get out there and be ferocious, or something like that. Still working on it.